What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Homebell Workshop. You guessed it, we're still working on the acoustic guitar. In the last couple episodes, we've seen the neck start to take some shape. I've got the headstock shaped, I've got the logo and everything installed on the headstock, and now I kind of feel like it's time to step up the pace. I really want to get this thing wrapped up. It's kind of one of those projects that after a while you're like, okay, how many more steps is there? Well, I still got a lot of steps to go, so I want to try to knock out as many of those steps as I can for this episode. Hopefully by the end of the video, we have basically a completed neck. Let's see if we can pull that off.
I'm going to begin by making the mortise and tenon on the neck as well as the body. I'm using a jig made by my friend Matt at Zimbelman Guitars to route the tenon on the neck. The jig just gets clamped into place, and then using a flush trim bit and a router, I can route away the material, leaving behind the tenon. Then the jig gets reversed to create the mortise. It gets lined up with the center line of the guitar and then clamped into place. Once it's lined up as perfect as I can get it, it's back to the router to cut the mortise. This jig makes the process of cutting the mortise and tenon very simple, but it does, however, create quite the mess.
This is ridiculous.
Now I can test the fit. So far everything seems to fit just fine.
It's a little uncomfortable yet.
Now I'm going to begin working on the heel cap, which will be made from some spalted maple, like all the other accent pieces on this guitar. I've got my 3D printed template that I'll attach with some double-sided tape and cut out the blank on the bandsaw. And I'll use the same router jig that I used for the headstock inlay to hold this tiny piece while I route it flush with my template. Before removing it from the template, I gave it a quick sand on a piece of flat acrylic just to make sure that the piece is nice and flat. Now I'll just apply a little bit of wood glue and glue it up, lining it up with the center lines that I have already marked on my neck. By getting this heel cap glued in place, I've basically defined what the shape of this part of the neck is going to be. We already have the headstock shape, now we have the heel cap shape. All we're missing is the fretboard shape. I'm going to start on the fretboard while this glue dries. After jointing my rosewood fretboard blank, I'm going to use some double-sided tape to stick it to my fretboard slotting template. Then this whole thing gets loaded into my fret slotting miter box, and I'll cut all of the fret slots. The scale length for this guitar is going to be 24.9 inches, so of course that's the fret slotting template that I'm using. Now I need to mark out a center line for the neck. I'm going to make all of my measurements off of the jointed edge so that everything stays nice and square. With the center line established, now I can make my measurements and mark out the actual dimensions for the fretboard. This is going to determine the actual taper of the fretboard, which in turn is going to dictate the shape of my neck.
Now we'll just trim this just outside of these lines over at the bandsaw.
The shooting board makes quick work of truing up the edge and taking the cut right down to my pencil line. It is important here to pay close attention to the grain direction. I did get just a tiny bit of tear out because I accidentally went against the grain for one of my first passes. It's not really a big deal, and you'll never see it once we radius the fretboard, but it is something to keep an eye on. Now at this point, I'm ready to install the fretboard markers. To mark out their locations, I just connect the ends of the fret slots to mark the center line of that fret. The point where those two lines meet should fall on the center line of my neck, and that's where I need to drill the hole. I'm going to use the same brass tube and seashell inlays that I've used on the last few builds. I'm really liking the look of that, so that's why I'm using it here. The brass tube gets tapped into the hole that I drilled, and then the center of the tube gets filled with the crushed seashells. The entire thing then gets slathered in thin CA glue to seal it all in and hold it in place. I'm using some Starbond super thin CA glue. If you guys want to check out some Starbond for yourself, there's a link in the video description. You can save 10% off your order. After filling the inlay with CA glue, I'll give it a couple of taps with a hammer. This helps to work the shells down in and eliminate air bubbles in the CA. Then I'll top it up again and let it dry naturally. Once the CA glue has dried, I'll use a sanding block to mostly level the inlays. I'm not worried about getting it perfectly flush here because we'll take care of that when I radius the fretboard. I'm not radiusing it right now, just leveling out some of the inlays. Now that the glue on the heel cap is dry, now I'm going to go back to the neck and mark out the locations for the threaded inserts on the tenon. You'll notice that while I'm drilling these out, I've got a couple of scrap blocks clamped to the sides. This is to prevent the sides of the tenon from splitting while I'm drilling and installing the threaded inserts. These particular threaded inserts just get installed with a screwdriver until they sit just below the surface of the tenon. Once I have both inserts installed, I'll use a little bit of thin CA glue just to wick down around the outside edge of the insert. This is going to help seal everything up and prevent the insert from working loose later on in the future. You have to be very careful at this step because you don't want any of the CA glue to get inside the insert and contaminate the threads. We only want it to wick down the outside of the insert.
Now to mark the locations of where I need to drill these holes in the body, I've taken some 1/4 bolts and ground a point on the end. I'll thread these into the inserts and then I'll use them to mark the location on the body to where I need to drill the holes.
Once I carefully slip the neck into place, I'll wiggle it back and forth just a little bit. Those sharp points will put a small mark on the neck block inside the body.
There's where I need to drill.
I'm drilling these holes by hand because, well, I can't fit this body in my drill press. I'm just trying to be as careful as I can, apply almost no pressure, and let the drill bit do most of the work. I'm also trying to keep it as straight and square as possible. If I push too hard, I risk a lot of tear out on the back side of the neck block.
Looks pretty good. Didn't really blow out, didn't really chip out or anything.
There's one last hole that I need to drill, and that's the hole for the truss rod adjustment nut. Here I've slipped the neck back into place, and I'm marking the location of the truss rod channel on the neck block inside the instrument. Drilling this hole is just a little bit tricky because I need to make sure that it not only does not poke through the top and ruin it, but it also has to line up with the access hole in the transverse bar so that we can actually make an adjustment later on. And it looks like everything lines up. Let's move on.
Now we're ready to do a test fit. I'm just going to drop the truss rod in. I've got some 1/4 bolts that I'm going to pass through from the inside, screwed into the neck. See how this thing fits. This is a little bit tricky. Wow, first bolt went right into place. And I'd show you this if I could, but I can barely get my hand in there myself. Wow, both bolts threaded right in. Double check that I can get to the truss rod. Yep, you can see it moving. Ah, man, I love it when a plan comes together. I think we're ready for a fretboard.
Before I glue the fretboard on, I'm going to spend a fair bit of time making sure all of my center lines and all of my marks line up. Once I have the fretboard clamped where it needs to be, I'm going to use some scrap pieces of wood with some double-sided tape and stick them to the excess material on the sides of the neck. This is going to help keep the fretboard from slipping side to side and a little bit front to back. It's just going to be a little bit less that I have to worry about as I clamp everything up. I'm trying to avoid having to use pins drilled through the fret slots. That's a very popular method to hold the fretboard in place, but it's not one that I'm really a fan of. I have done that before in the past, and it does work well, but for some reason I just don't like having to drill that extra hole in there. Once I have the glue applied, it's then that I'll install the carbon fiber rods. A few careful taps with a hammer make sure that they're seated fully. And now we can just drop the fretboard in place. I know that the blocks that are stuck to the side of the neck are going to align it left to right. I've also added one more block on the headstock to keep it from slipping forward and make sure that the alignment for the nut slot is correct.
There, I think that'll do it.
While the glue on the fretboard is drying, I'm going to go ahead and start roughing out my bridge. I have a 3D printed model of my bridge that I'm going to double stick to the rosewood blank. Before I cut away the waste material, I'm going to first drill some pilot holes where the bridge pins will eventually go. With the waste material removed, now it's back to my router jig to hold the bridge in place while I route it flush with the template. To make the taper on the wings of the bridge, I've stuck the bridge blank to a piece of scrap wood using some toothpicks as dowels to hold it in place. This way, I can pass it under the drum of my drum sander and very carefully and slowly sand that taper into the edge. Is it ironic that I say carefully and slowly as we watch this fast-forwarded? I don't know. Tell me in the comments.
There's our roughed out bridge. And also, the glue's dry on the fretboard, so really I think we've got all of our hard points set. We've got the heel cap to determine our shape down here. We've got the fretboard that's going to determine the width of the neck. We've got our headstock routed. Really, all we need to do now is remove all of this excess material and let's get to shaping this neck. You may have noticed that I didn't do any side marker dots just yet. My intent was to do it after the fretboard was radiused because I didn't want to risk exposing the side marker dots because I drilled them too high. But I can't really do that, at least not very well, because this has to get glued to the guitar body before I radius the fretboard. So really I'll just shape the neck, get everything to size, then we'll install the side marker dots.
There is a lot of excess material along the side of the neck. I decided to remove this on the bandsaw first, that way I don't have to carve it all the way. A quick word of caution though, don't try to do this the way I'm doing it. This probably wasn't the best idea. The neck was really not all that stable, and there was a chance that the blade may have caught and pulled the thing down, maybe putting my fingers in an unsafe position. So even though I'm doing it here, don't do this at home. You're better off doing this with the fretboard face down, but I was trying to use the edge of the fretboard as a guide for the saw. That way I didn't have to transfer the lines to the back, but take the time to do that. It's much safer. I've got my neck set up in my carving book that I made in a previous video. I'll put a link to that in the description. I have the fretboard extension held in place using a padded caul, and I've also made a padded caul which matches the angle of the headstock. That way it's held securely but doesn't put any excess stress on the angled headstock. And it's time to grab the trusty Shinto rasp and start making some sawdust. I decided that there's just a little too much material in this area, so to speed up the process, I trimmed some of it away using a coping saw. As I carve along, I stop quite often and check the thickness. Once I start to get close, then I just file that portion down to the final thickness, then I know exactly what material I need to remove. With the thickness set at both ends of the neck, then I can just remove any material that doesn't line up with those marks. Like a lot of people say, this is a very satisfying step. It's cool to be able to see the shape of the neck come out of the square blank. It's an awesome opportunity to just throw on some headphones, put on some tunes, and just rock out while you're making a lot of sawdust. And I almost forgot one of the most important steps. Make sure to stop, take a break, use your files as drumsticks, and just jam out to some air drums for a second. This step really is required. Serious, it is. Very important. Once we're done carving, we'll give everything a good sanding to finish it all up. With the shaping done, except for maybe a little bit of fine-tuning later, it's time to get the neck fit to the body. This is where we get to adjust the angle and make sure all of our lines line up with the center line of the instrument. I start by chalking up the neck joint and then using a chisel to dig a little trough, so that way when we floss this with sandpaper, we don't have quite as much material to remove. My chisel's either getting dull or this end grain of the Paduke is pretty hard stuff. Now I can install the neck and secure it with the bolts. I'll temporarily tape my bridge in place on the soundboard. This way I can compare center lines and heights so that I know how much I need to adjust the fit of the neck. Now I can use some sandpaper and slip it in the joint of the neck, and depending on which way I pull it, I can either adjust the side-to-side alignment or the front-to-back alignment. In my case, I had to adjust both. Just like when shaping the neck, I stop often to check my work. I don't want to go too far in any direction, so it's best to check often and go slow, take your time. Because I had never done this before, this was a step that I was a little bit worried about. Overall, it's really not a hard process. It is, however, a little bit time consuming, at least for me, but make sure you take careful measurements as you go. For my particular plans and bridge height, I wanted to have my straight edge about 1 millimeter or so above the top of the bridge, and this is with no frets in the neck. That way, once we fret the neck and add the saddle, we should be at about the right height.
All my center lines line up. I think we're finally there. Well, now I need to make a correction that I said earlier in one of the videos on this build. This step of setting the neck angle has been by far the most tedious step. It took the longest. I spent hours and hours trying to get this just right. My guess really is that I had some angles incorrect earlier in the process that I had to correct now, but regardless of how long it took, which really was a long time, we got it set. The center line of the neck lines up with the center line of the body, lines up with the center line of the bridge, and everything is in line left to right. We've got all the angles good to go. That step is now behind us. I feel like this is a good stopping point for this episode because right now I've got a couple options which way I want to go with the build, and I need to kind of figure out the best way that I want to move forward. I could glue the neck as well as the bridge in place. I've got them both located right there where they need to live, but I'm also contemplating moving on, doing some pore filling now before I glue these together. I just feel like it's going to be easier to sand that pore filler now. That may be the route that I'm going to go, but you're going to have to stay tuned because I'll update you on that in the next episode. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you next time. Hey, look at that. It looks like a guitar.